Okay, looks like we maybe start. Nobody else on the chat, I didn't see. Or in any way, let's start. For beginning, I want to introduce the participators of this panel from different countries. This is Natalia Theodoridou from Greece. This is Novakova from Czech Republic. Hello. And Aleksandar Žiljak from Croatia.
Hi, everybody.
And I am as moderator from the Russia. And our panel was mentioned about sci-fi in the East, from the East, like something opposite to the sci-fi from the West. And we just talking about this and discussing some of the questions. First of all, I wanna, in my opinion, giving some of the short introduction for sci-fi in our countries. This is not names. This is only steps of the development of sci-fi, and in my opinion, it looks like very similar in many situations, and this is related to the political situation which was happened after the World War II. If we're talking about development of the sci-fi genres in our country, in small exceptions from Russia or from the Czech Republic, if we are mentioned Czech, mainly sci-fi, we are start after the war, from the 50s, and if I read some of the history remarks from Greece, maybe later, because it was related to the specific situation after the war in the Greece. And mainly related to the situation after the World War II, we are all introduced to the socialistic company, like big bloc, and this was tending to situation that main sci-fi genres was science fiction, with no fantasy or like this. And for a long time, it was the such situation, and this is changed after beginning in the USSR, the type of the changes related to the perestroika, and finish the socialistic rules in the Europe, and separation and organizing new countries like the separation Czechoslovakia on Czech and Slovakia, separation of the Yugoslavia on some countries, and included the Croatia also as a new country of Europe. And in these situations, it was the also change in paradigm for sci-fi. First of all, and we now organizing this conference due to this reason also, many of translated works from English, directly from English, go to the markets of the countries. And they absolutely, for example, in Russia, they for a few years absolutely removed local authors from the markets. And it's necessary time to reproduce own new authors with new styles, with new genres, etc. And of course, the second very interesting situations, after removing the domination of science fiction, we was introduced to the fantasy. Looks like these genres. In my memory, it was 19th when I first time read the Tolkien, which was translated, not first time, but printed in the Russian. And later, I we may produced a lot of fantasy books from the genres. And in these situations, we have some of the vision of the future, which was related to the American types or English language type of the sci-fi. With my small introduction in the situation, maybe some of the my colleagues can add it to situations or no?
Well,
Okay.
if I may, the situation in the Czech Republic was slightly different because before the Second World War, we didn't only have Karel Čapek, who is, of course, the most famous Czech science fiction author, with his drama RUR that introduced the word robot, and it has a 100th anniversary this year, actually this November. And he also wrote The War with the Salamanders and other famed works. But he certainly wasn't alone. Even before Čapek, we had, for example, František Běhounek, and today we could say that he wrote adventure stories that sometimes went a bit into science fiction, and usually with an emphasis on technology stemming from what was known at the time. And we also had fantasy authors, but they probably wouldn't like being called fantasy authors because they rather at that time fantasy wasn't so established as a genre, and they wrote mostly ghost stories and supernatural tales. And one of the most famous is Jiří Karásek Zelvovic, and he wrote several novels that centered around protagonists who met with the unknown, the supernatural. And what's interesting is that in several of these novels, we can also observe elements of gay relationships, because Karásek himself was gay, and he advocated for reform for homosexual people. And for example, in Ganymede, we have a young man who meets two different, interesting, slightly older figures. And one of them is a sculptor who wishes to make a sculpture based on the young man Radovan. And it turns out that the sculpture is a golem. And the sculptor wanted to make a perfect companion for himself, to create a perfect man out of clay. And that also ties the legend of the golem, which is very typical for Prague, and we could say that it's sometimes even overused. Yeah, and of course, we've got many German-speaking authors of the pre-World War II era who wrote science fiction and fantasy, as we would label it today. And the most famous are, of course, Franz Kafka and Gustav Meyrink. So we've got quite a rich history even before World War II. And after that, it's basically, as you said, science fiction dominated. We had lots of translations of works from the Soviet Union, and of course, translations from Polish. Stanislav Lem was widely read at the time and still is. So yeah, I guess that's the addendum as to the Czech science fiction and fantasy.
Any other? Aleksandar?
Well, Croatia also had some science fiction before World War II. Several authors wrote novels that are undoubtedly science fiction. But most of these novels were actually published in daily or weekly installments of various newspapers. Very few of them have been published in book form, even to the present day. Maria Jurić Zagorka's Red Ocean, which is 1918 to 1919. She was writing it as the World War I was closing. And then some novels of Albion Digal, which is a pen name, and Stan Rager, which is also a pen name of Stanko Radovanovic and Zvonimir Furtinger. They wrote science fiction novels which were published in installments, daily installments. And then we had a break in both science fiction publication and writing until, say, late 1950s. And it probably came a renewed interest in science fiction in late 1950s, probably came with rapid industrialization of Yugoslavia and Croatia, and increased education, public education on all levels, from literacy courses for illiterate people, which were many in former Yugoslavia at that time, all the way across to the educational system, all the way to universities. Then there was again a smaller break until 1976. I think the history of Croatian science fiction in its uninterrupted form can be followed from 1976, from publication of magazine Sirius, when in that period, late 1970s, there was Sirius. Sirius was important because they included at least one story of former Yugoslav authors, most of them Croatian, per each issue. Sirius was a monthly. And then came several very, very important novels. After the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1990, the production increased, and we have a certain number of science fiction novels published every year, not too many. We have several magazines. We had Futura, which is now defunct. We have Sirius B, which is dedicated, again, mostly to translated stories. And we have Ubik, which I co-edit, which is dedicated to Croatian, but we also include Serbian and Bosnia-Herzegovina authors. So basically, the stories from Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian language area. And what I can say about it right now is that basically it is my feeling that at least in Croatia, a large number of science fiction is actually closer to a broader term of speculative fiction. We may discuss it later, but I don't think many authors can be considered purely science fiction authors. Myself, to some extent, because I also dabble in fantasy and stuff like that. But most authors today, in particular those writing the stories, are either in some sorts of speculative fiction or fantasy. And I must add that our fantasy production is very often of quite a low quality, unfortunately. So that's it for the brief situation.
Natalia, can you talk now to us something about Greece?
Yes, I am not an expert in the history of science fiction in Greece, but I was going to mention ancient examples of science fictional concepts. We have Daedalus, who created, you could call them androids today, and you have Talos, the giant robot that Hephaestus created. And then, yeah, you are right that we were a bit late in the in catching up with science fiction after World War II. There were translations, and I recently shared on Twitter a thread that includes a couple of articles that have an overview of both speculative fiction and science fiction magazines in Greece in the 80s and 90s, and also an overview of novels from that time until now. But I think that in the past decade, there's been a boom of science fiction and speculative fiction writing in Greece. And I would say that the quality is actually very, very promising and very encouraging. And if I could talk about the subjects of those works for a minute, you see subjects that are very familiar from Anglophone scenes, obviously, as that influence is huge, but it's always filtered through our very personal and cultural baggage, and especially when it comes to problem solving. For example, there's an upcoming anthology of translated science fiction stories from Greek to English and also to Italian by Luna Press and Future Fiction. And there you get, for example, dystopias of ecological disasters, but you also within them, I mean, ecological dystopias is a very common subject in science fiction, right? But within that, you have the ways people respond to those are unique to the locale. You have co-ops, for example, that are an evolution of a very local kind of anarchist thought. Or in one story that was recently in Interzone by Evgenia Triantafilou, called Those We Serve. It's a story about androids serving as menial workers on a Greek island, which is, again, a very common subject in science fiction. It's about personhood, it's about autonomy, but it's also filtered through the experiences of a country that relies heavily on tourism. So that's the kind of line of thought that I think differentiates a lot of our modern science fiction. You get stories about immigration, you get stories about exile and diaspora, you get stories about being subjected to military and economic forces that are much larger than yours. And you also get something that I call visions of futures past. You know, Greece was not a part of the space race in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was hardly industrial at the time compared to many countries in the West. But now you get a generation of writers who reimagine that past, find alternatives of that past. So we go, why not have a Greek astronaut on Mars in the 1960s? Or a space diaspora that is not trying to colonize or conquer space, but who are themselves the children of refugees and immigrants. And even going further back, we reimagine Greek mythology, but in space. And I think that's quite exciting and freeing, because when you can reimagine your past, you can also create new possibilities for your future.
Okay, thank you. And so you giving some of the proposal to first of my question, which I was wanna talking about, and this is related situation. What the vision of future our SFSN have right now about how it must look like. What preferred? For me, it's very hard questions because, for example, it's a situation happened in our country. We have about 500 books per year, not non-translated, write it in Russian. And it's possibly say that we have at least 5 or 6 variants of the future, which most popular, some more popular, some not popular. For example, we have a very popular situation with sci-fi in the some of the person from the future return to the past, change something, and and change the history and change the future like this way. Also, we have, unfortunately, due to the situation with development of the technology, we don't have a good quality of hard science fiction future related to creation of the spacecraft, or in the, for example, for research into the deep space, or etc. And what's happened in your countries? What, in your opinion, what preferable future looks for you, for your sci-fi stance right now?
Well, in Czech science fiction and fantasy, it really varies. After the Velvet Revolution, there was, of course, a lot of new fiction that couldn't be published during the communist regime, criticizing it heavily. And I remember, for example, a story Nos to závaží by Josef Pecinovsky. It could be loosely translated as carry the burden or carry the weight. And it was a metaphor for the oppressive regime and a quite well done story. And of course, we had a proliferation of fantasy and also of quite derivative works that borrowed heavily from the especially American science fiction and fantasy that could now be published and couldn't be published before. But nowadays, the visions of the future are, I would say, very diverse, and to some extent copy the developments we see in the Anglophone world, not by being derivative, but by some of the, let's say, social forces being very similar in the Czech Republic as, for instance, in the US or the UK. We also have a very populist government, and we see a rise of nationalism. So many science fiction authors, myself included, try to warn before that and imagine a future that isn't so dystopian as it might look like we're hurtling towards one now. And we can also see writers retreating to, let's say, more escapist worlds, very far futures, galactic empires, and very wide scope stories that are meant mostly for entertainment, but we also see lots of various current influences in them. And of course, the primary aim of most literature is to entertain. So that's not saying that the more current science fiction is not entertaining, God forbid. And as to hard SF, as you mentioned, we actually have several authors who write in this genre a lot. One of them is my colleague and friend Tomáš Petrásek, and he actually translated his novella Last Watch into English recently, and I do hope he'll find a publisher for it, because it's a story that at first seems like a third world fantasy, and then we can see that it's actually hard science fiction. And unfortunately, telling more would be spoiling the story for you. But let's say that there is a fight for survival that's very, very human in spite of the protagonists being an alien race. And it's
sorry,
inspired by actual astronomy and exoplanet discoveries.
sorry, I have a question from the our participants. And can you recommend any optimistic or positive science fictions translated in English?
Translated in English. Okay, yeah. Well, I can
from your country, yes.
Lots of my fiction is optimistic. Some of it it's not translated because I have been writing predominantly in English since 2013 when I was published in Clarkesworld for the first time. But yeah, I guess that even this first story, The Symphony of Ice and Dust, is optimistic in the end, because although the protagonists suffer personal tragedies and they are shipwrecked, there is hope and there is this longing for discovery. And this is also a hard science fiction story about two different expeditions to the dwarf planet Sedna, separated by nearly 10,000 years. And I would also say that another story that's both into hard science fiction and optimistic is Hexagrammaton by Hanuš Steiner. again, it includes tragedies, it includes sacrifices, but the ending is optimistic. There is lots of hope, and basically knowledge prevails. And for me, that's very optimistic. And that's another element that Tomáš Petrásek's Last Watch also shares, even though, and I'm a bit spoiling it now, the protagonist dies in the end, but the knowledge he has amassed doesn't. And he managed to cross the gap of time that no one could before him, and to actually leave this scientific discovery to other generations. So I guess that for me, many science-centered stories are optimistic. And yeah, so check out Hanuš Sajner, check out myself, and as to other authors, well, Lucia Lukačevičová writes fantasy more than science fiction, and her novellas Spark of Thought and Spark of Eternity have appeared in English translation. Or actually, these are not translations, she wrote them in English. And these are alternate histories and fantasy, but again, the ending is optimistic, hopeful, although a lot of things in between aren't. So yeah, I guess that these are my recommendations for the optimistic stories. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Aleksandar?
Okay, we've got currently published, in my estimate, some 15 to 20 books. Science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction, call it what you like. Depends on subgenres, etc. Annually. So about 15 to 20 books annually. There are some story collections, anthologies mostly prepared for conventions. And there is Ubik that publishes about anything between 20 and 40 stories of Croatian and Serbian authors. Okay, we'll stick to the Croatians. Quite honestly, I've got a funny feeling that Croatia has no future. It's as simple as that.
Okay. And
we have suffered 30 years of total mismanagement of economy, which has nothing to do with war. Our war damages exact in immediate war zones are practically negligent compared to, I don't know, World War II or Korean War, or any major war that you can think of. But our publishing industry is in shambles. The circulation of individual titles of individual books is 300 copies or less. And our publishers are mostly dependent on state, on the Republic of Croatia, Ministry of Culture, for both support to publish the books and then support in the sense of buying of books for public libraries. And basically many publishers are now profiling their publishing programs and their circulations and everything to 150 copies sold for public libraries, because individual market, people going and coming and buying books, is quite low. And this, of course, shows in the quality of production. This shows in the fact that nobody can live today of writing. Not even just live, but make an honest, proper, satisfactory fee. And basically, I'm witnessing that as a co-editor of Ubik. I believe we have lost some authors. They stopped publishing. They stopped writing. The moment you get a child, your literary production is zero. Period. I could list you cases of such examples, and this, coupled with generally very negative feeling about current Croatian society, I believe that the impression is we don't have future. We don't have proper science fiction. Very few authors write anything about space. There is some fantasy, and many of the fantasy titles are frankly not worth the paper they were printed on. Frankly, poor writing, period. We have very little, almost none, real science fiction. Something is produced, but very little, almost none. And even if people have some ideas, quite often they don't have literary skills to convert them into good texts, into good novels. And I started to receive a lot of texts, a lot of stories that are, I don't know what they are. They're obviously some sort of fantasy, but they are closer to fairy tales than classic, I don't know, swords and sorcery or epic fantasy or things like that. We get stories that I feel sometimes chase their own tail, you know. I don't know what people are trying to say, except maybe to give an expression to their hopelessness and feeling of being lost in the literary grinder of everyday life. And there are people who practically are functioning on one way or another of survival mode for decades or longer. And this shows. In my opinion, as I say, I think people don't feel they have a future, so our literature does not deal with future, most often. And we are suffering, there will be more problems because we are suffering massive depopulation. We have lost anything between 300,000 and 400,000 people just from the moment Croatia entered the European Union, because people went to work abroad in Western Europe, in Scandinavia most often, Ireland, Germany, Sweden. And these are younger people. These are young professionals, for instance, medical professions on all levels of medical professions. These are people who actually should be, including STEM educated people. These are people who actually should be the audience for science fiction in general, and also the writers of science fiction. And we are losing them. What is left is some strange mixture of nationalism, clericalism, village mentality. But I don't think villages ever functioned that way. Maybe I'm wrong. I never living in the village myself. So which is now slowly overtaking not just Croatian culture, but also Croatian, the frame of mind of Croatian politicians, public persons, the entire society. Our main subjects, aside from Corona and earthquake in Zagreb from March this year, and both of them, frankly, are relatively mild. Frankly. Okay? When they talk pandemia, I think of Ebola, I think of bubonic plague, I think of SARS, I think of MERS, such stuff. This, I'm not saying it's not serious, but it's a relatively mild pandemia. Okay, precautions, take precautions, stay healthy, stay safe. I don't have a problem with that. But compared to what it might be, this is a relatively mild pandemia. Compared to what the earthquake in Zagreb could have been, this was a relatively mild earthquake. Unpleasant. I was on the 9th floor. I'm on the 9th floor, and I was awake when the earthquake struck, and it was unpleasant. But we did not have a single building from which we had to pick up people, for which we had to dig out people with dogs. We didn't have a single building collapsing. We had one casualty in the earthquake, one on a city of 800,000 people. Okay. So basically, okay. what our main themes are? World War II in Croatia, abortion, or rather banning abortion, clericalism, churches, stuff like that. And corruption, widespread corruption and literal thievery, stealing of anything that can be stolen materially or financially on all levels of Croatian public life. And I don't know. I myself don't feel optimistic, and I think many other people don't feel optimistic. And on the other hand, people are not able to convert displeasure with all this into a strong science fiction or even fantasy or something like that. This is also something I notice. People seem to be evading or talking very generally about deformations of Croatian society in any way, even in metaphorical way for which science fiction and fantasy should be perfect. I don't know how things will go. Thank you.
Thank you too. Natalia,
Yes.
as you mentioned, you are not so good in knowing the situation in Greece. You are more related to the translations.
Well, I am familiar with the current situation in Greece, but before I go to that, could I just shout out one Croatian writer that I love, Dora Klinjic. She was my Clarion West classmate, and she writes mainly in English, and she had her first story in Clark's World, her debut story. It was Balkan science fiction, basically, we called it, Balkans in space, basically. And she recently also had a story in Fireside called Bury Me Standing, which is about future Belgrade. And it's just fantastic. And she's a scientist as well. She's also writing a game
Excuse
about
me.
Nikola Tesla.
Excuse me, what's her name again?
Dora Klinjic.
Well, we never heard. Are you sure she's Croatian or Serbian?
Yes, no, she's Croatian. I'm absolutely certain. She's from Zagreb.
Never heard of her.
Definitely, she's young, she's new, and she's emerging. Definitely someone to look out for. And yeah, and she's also writing a game about Nikola Tesla, which is also very exciting for me. Anyway, back to Greece. Even I think there is an interesting discrepancy between short science fiction and novel-length science fiction in Greece. You used to have magazines that published really high-quality stuff, but now they're all gone. So we're left with the efforts of the Athenian Science Fiction Club, who often have readings. They publish their own magazine, which is mostly about the inner workings of science fiction in Greece and what happens abroad, but not its main focus is not to publish stories. They do publish some stories, and they also translate stories from other languages to Greek, and they also read those stories live often. But what we also see is that even though publishers used to snub science fiction and speculative fiction works before, now when you see science fiction novels in mainstream publishers, Michalis Manolios, for example, who is one of the most prominent science fiction writers in Greece, has published he has published 2 science fiction collections in earlier years, but he also published a novel with Kedros, which is one of the major publishers in Greece. And now I think just today he announced that he's also publishing a short story collection with the same publisher. And I find that very encouraging for the kind of reception that science fiction can have in Greece from now on. It's no longer, a marginal literary genre. It's up and coming, and I find that very hopeful.
Okay. Next, my questions also was related to the translations, and mainly we want to see translated one of the best things printed in our languages, and its names, for example, like iconic things, etc. And we have also a problem for the translation, for lost in translation, and should we try to simplify works when we translate it from our language to the English for the removing or lost of the intricacies of our national language, or we want to waiting some of the translator who will be genius for translation from our languages to the English. And also we have also questions, something related to this. What of the local nominated best winning books ever been translated in other languages from your countries? From Russia, I don't know the good situation with translation from Russian to English very well, because I didn't read translated book in English, unfortunately. I know that some of the big authors which who write in between for sci-fi, magic realism, or like this, for example, as Victor Pelevin or Sorokin, were translated in English or in other languages. But this is not, these authors are going outside from the sci-fi community. They are not one of that other person thinking they are sci-fi writers. For local sci-fi awards, so I don't remember good translation in English for the last 10 or 15 years. Maybe only this year was translated novel of the Maria and Sergei Dichenko, Vita Nostra. They was translated on English, and late it was translated in French also. This is the novel from the awards, but main authors Ukrainian, some of the situation when some of the authors living in Ukraine were writing for the big market in the Russian. What about you in your countries?
Well, as to your first question about simplifying the translation, I don't believe it's the right choice, but I also don't believe that it's necessary a lot between Czech and English, because the sentence structure is not so different, the cultural basics are not so different. So in my view, a translation should convey the sense of the original work as accurately as possible. And I mean the sense, not the actual words, not the actual sentences. And as to your other question about award-winning works, well, one of the most award-winning science fiction series lately is Mycelium by Vilma Kadlečková, who is a prolific Czech science fiction author, sometimes also writing fantasy. And actually a short excerpt exists in English, and I do hope it will be submitted to some agents and publishers. And in addition, I can announce that this series actually just received a contract for publication in Russian. So you'll be able to read the translation of Mycelium hopefully in a few years. And I will add the link to the Czech website for the books into the YouTube chat soon. So I'm very happy about this, and I do believe that Mycelium really requires translation into as many languages as possible. Of course, Vilma is not the only award-winning author we currently have. Well, Hanuš Sajnar has won multiple awards for his stories, and I have translated several of them, so they actually exist in English. Tomáš Petrásek was also award nominated, and I do hope Last Watch finds a publisher. Lucie Lukačevičová has been a winner and finalist for basically all the Czech genre awards there are. And apart from the two novelettes I mentioned, Spark of Thought and Spark of Eternity, she has a story upcoming in a speculative fiction anthology about fighting fascism, which will be published, I think, later this year or maybe early next year. So she's also very prolific, and she has started writing in English. And in addition, I'm not sure if these have been award nominated, but Jan Kotoč ran a successful Indiegogo campaign for the translation of his space opera novels 2 years ago, and 2 of them were already published in English. It's the series Frontiers of the Imperium. So yeah, I guess these are the most prominent examples. Then there is, for instance, Karolina Francová. She hasn't got anything in English yet, but she is brilliant in both science fiction and fantasy, and she mostly writes darker stuff. She doesn't shy away from sex, but not in a, let's say, like reader gratifying way. It's just there for the sex, but in a more psychological way. So yeah. Oh, and of course, Jan Hlávka and Jana Vybíralová are writing a very popular space opera series called Algor, which also won several awards. And I do hope that it's going to find a translator and publisher, because it might also be of interest to readers abroad. Well, I think that's it. I mean, I could continue with other names like Františka Hrabenska, but there are so many. So yeah, I guess this is it for the moment.
Okay, thank you. Aleksandar, I know that you have a Sfera Awards. Do you have translations from Sfera Awards in English? Aleksandar, sorry, we don't have a sound.
Sorry, I muted my mic and I forgot about it. Okay, sorry, my apologies. I'm new at this. I only had one Zoom meeting this morning for 2 hours. Okay, I have my story collection. I had my story collection, What Color is the Wind? Or Welche Farbe hat der Wind, published in 2017 in Germany. It was promoted on Eurocon in Dortmund in June 2017. I don't know how much of the English version is available. It contains 5 science fiction stories. German version is available on Amazon. And the problem is I translated all my texts into English myself. So I translated from Croatian into English. And the German translations were made from my English translations, which is not the best of choices in my opinion. I don't know how good are German translations. My German is not so good that I can assess that. I have translated these English translated stories, which are both science fiction and fantasy, have been published all across Europe. Some of them have been published in the States. Some of them have been published in Asia. There's one story published in China, one story published in India. Allegedly, something has been published in the Philippines, but I haven't received any copies or confirmations yet. And I can announce that within few days, I believe pre-orders will be opened for my new story collection published in Great Britain. The collection is titled As the Distant Bells Toll, and it's fantasy. It's 8 fantasy stories. And no, none of them includes my award-winning stories, unfortunately. You asked, should we simplify translations? In my opinion, no. There are differences between English and other languages, of course, and some things that are said one way in English are said different way in the other languages and vice versa. But simplifying the texts or expression or something like that, I believe, no, it is not a good way to go. The problem, in my opinion, in translating anything into other languages, and if you want it to be done by a professional translator, which I am not, the problem is translators' fees. Basically, if you have a novel of, say, 250 pages, you're looking at, I don't know, several thousand euros minimum. And we have a catch-22 here, because how can you sell your novel to the potential publisher that might publish the translation if you cannot show him what the novel is about. And in order to do it, at least part of the novel has to be in English. So this is a big catch-22 practically, which we face. I had my novel Poseidonia translated into Czech language and published in, I don't know, 2016 or so. It was translated by Jan Kravčík. It was published by Gorgona Books in Prague. But Jan Kravčík studied South Slavistics in Zagreb. He knows Croatian. So when he showed interest, somebody recommended me to him. I could send him the manuscript and he could immediately read it. And when he decided to publish the book, he could translate it into the Czech himself. And Republic of Croatia had or still has some support programs for foreign translations. So Ministry of Culture subsidized his expenses with, I think it was 1,000 euros. This is not secret. Results of such or contests are published. So basically he got 1,000 euros from the Ministry of Culture as a subsidy for his translation effort. What I could see, the effort was good. The book looks very nice, but I'm not sure that it achieved the success I was hoping for in the Czech Republic.
Well,
I don't know why.
certainly popular with the readers who read it, but I don't think it had a so wide circulation. But the reception was mostly positive. Yeah. But
the reception was mostly
very interesting that you mentioned the financial side of publishing, because I can't imagine any genre work getting a subsidy in the Czech Republic. Basically, it's all just for, let's say, high literary works, and no science fiction and fantasy would have a chance. So basically,
no, this was not a matter of, this wasn't even a matter of award, genre awards or anything. Mr. Kravčík applied to our Ministry of Culture in Croatia. I told him that the program exists, and
I mean,
he was granted 1,000 euros.
In Croatia's ministry, but not the Czech one. I mean, a Czech science fiction novel with a hard time getting any subsidies. Yeah. That might be why only
I managed to get some subsidies for writing the novels, 2 of them as a matter of fact, because there is also such program of helping writers to write. Again, subsidized by Ministry of Croatia. They give either 3-month or 6-month or 12-month subsidy. You can mostly hope for 3 months, but it's also about somewhat less than 1,000 euros a month. So you do your own math. For 3 months, it's almost 3,000 euros. However, you cannot apply every year. Okay, so you cannot exactly base your home economy on that, because you cannot apply every year. And they want to see the book for which last subsidy was received. They want to see it printed and existing. And if you know that the cycle of making a book, of printing a book lasts, say, at least 2 years, then from the time you get this subsidy, by the time you write the book and then have it published, you look at least at a 2 or 3 years period. So you cannot get this subsidy every year. Okay, but such subsidies exist, such programs exist. They will probably be cut considerably in the following years. I expect it to be so, because we will have a new austerity measures introduced, I believe, within the next months and so on. But there were some subsidies. In my opinion, translating books into foreign languages, in my opinion, in my experience, was pretty much a waste of time for me, financially at least. I created some renommee, shall I put it that way, but as far as money is concerned, it wasn't very successful. I believe I will start experimenting more seriously with writing in English immediately, which will save me time of translating my own Croatian manuscripts into English, particularly if I'm talking about novels. And then I will see what will the success of this, my new fantasy collection in Britain will be. It is published by Cheryl Morgan and her Wizard Tower Press, and we shall see how successful it will be. I believe the pre-ordering will start in the next few days. I've seen the cover and it's gorgeous. And there are 8 stories which I consider good, if I may say so. And I did some interior art for these stories. And I think we are going to have a pretty good book. How successful it will be remains to be seen. So, and also it is a question of how far we will be able to reach among the audience. We don't know.
Oh, okay, thank you. Asking Natalia about the loss of translations and possibility translations from Greece.
Well, to your more general question about translations, first, I would like to say that I don't believe in translation. I don't think it's possible. And don't get me wrong, I admire translators deeply, but I think good translations are works of art in their own right. They have a deep connection with the source material, but they're not the same thing. And for me, that's because I think that language is something that is embodied. You breathe with language, you brain with language. So you cannot, and that's inextricable from meaning. You cannot have one without having the other. So for me, translation is an art. And when we're talking about works in translation, we're not exactly talking about the original works. All that said, like Aleksandar, I tend to, for that reason, write directly in English. It's much more difficult for me to translate something that I wrote in Greek than rewriting it from the beginning in English or writing it in English directly. But from what I know, works from, I don't know any science fiction novels or speculative fiction novels written in Greek that have been translated in English after they've been published. For short fiction, I think the total of all the short stories that have been translated from Greek to other languages are thanks to Francesco Verso from Future Fiction. We have the anthology by Luna Press that's forthcoming next year. But there are many writers Greek writers or Greek-speaking writers who write in English directly, and they have had their works translated in other languages. I've had translations in Portuguese, Italian, French, Estonian, Arabic, Chinese. I'm probably forgetting some, and I know other writers have as well. So it's much easier to have your nationally inflected work translated to other languages if you write it in English.
Okay.
Intervene, I totally agree, because my stuff has been translated into Chinese, Bulgarian, Estonian, Romanian, German, and it was always through English. There was just one example of a project that I think hasn't finished yet, of translating into Azerbaijani, but these were students of Bohemistics, so it was a special case. But yeah, it all goes through English. And when I was editing an anthology of European science fiction in Filipino translation with Jaroslav Olša Jr., we sought stories in English from various European countries that could be translated into Filipino, because
I'm still waiting the second part of that anthology.
Yeah, I know.
And Mr. Olša told me that it is done and asked me if I received a copy. I still haven't. So.
Well, the second part is upcoming. The first one was published already this year.
Okay.
And I remember that we have a translation of Yulia Novakova in Russian also. One short story.
Yeah.
Yes, and in our situations, it's very strange. Looks like that very popular from some of the diversity of sci-fi fan. Very popular cycle of their novels from the University of Metro by Dmitry Gluchovsky. and the novels of Dmitry were translated in many languages. I see at least 30 different languages for translation of these novels. And for me, it looks like the community of the lovers of Metro University, it's close community related only the person who like these novels, and not so many person often say that, oh, that's great book, or like this. Unfortunately, as I mentioned previously, from the not so many books which were awarded different local awards, especially sci-fi awards, were translated in different languages. For example, I'm also, when we are talking about this, I remember about translation of Anna Starobinets on English and at least on French, and she is very popular on French. She were awarded by French award also for her novels, but now she write science fiction. For now, she's more interested for writing young adult books or like this. And for me, it looks like it's sometimes what happened for the translations. We have some of the time separation between good books was awarded and a possibility for translation in other different languages. And for these situations, time changes, everything can changes for local community for thinking about this. Sometimes some of the not bad books, but not mentioned as sci-fi books with some of the magic realism or like this were also translated in different languages. For example, Evgeny Vodolaskin, a philologist, his novels were translated in different languages, in Slavonic, in Slavonic or English, etc. And I think after finish the discussion, we maybe prepare a list of the translations for a person who is interested in this, because we may say not correctly, not audibly good, and for person it's not easy to understand for unknown names for this. And maybe due to the limit of time, we have I'll discuss one of the other questions which I think into for discussion. If we have a problem sometimes for translation some of the nuance of our languages in English in books, maybe we have a possibility to see possibility translation with non-linguistic forms of our book, of our stories. For example, connected stories with comic strips, or some of the book trailers, or in best situations, in local situation with local community creation of some of the short movies for the stories, or like this. What do you think about this? This is easy. Can this make it easy understanding your stories for non-English for English speakers? Because in this situation we are not using Lawson translation without languages. We have visual parameters for possibility to translate our story to the person.
There is a problem. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I don't think it would make so much difference in my case because I mostly write directly in English, but I have also participating in creating a board game for an educational comic about seismology, so that will actually appear in English and other languages pretty soon. But as to stories, for some other authors, it might prove a better way. But in overall, I think most Czech fiction can be translated into English, and other languages pretty okay in literature.
Aleksandar?
In my opinion, okay, you are talking about the possibility of comics adaptations of non-English texts. There have been such adaptations. It is not impossible, but again, we are facing this difficulty of small culture, as it is sometimes said, which has to break out on a large cultural market. In other words, whatever you do, you need a publisher. You need somebody who will support your book. You will need somebody who will invest in it. You need somebody who will market it. You need somebody, as in the final on the final level, who will buy it. And that's a problem. This is when you talk about transferring our stories into comic books, you practically introduce at least two more persons into the story. Somebody who will write the script, because writing a story is one thing, writing a comic strip is another thing, writing a movie or television script is something else entirely different again. And you need at least one artist who will illustrate the strip, the comic, at least one. If he or she is penciling, inking, and if need be, painting. If not, we are talking at least about at least three more persons. So basically, all what you do is introduce more persons that, of course, need to be paid. I'm sorry, I have to be pleasant, but it all amounts to whether somebody is paid for his or her work or not. On the other hand, I would like to make to pass a single objection to all this story. Why are we talking only about English? Translating into English. Why are we not talking about translating into Chinese? 1.5 billion people of potential audience. Why don't we talk about translating into Hindi? Yet another 1 billion or so of the audience. Why don't we talk, and Eastern Europe, not Greece so much, but Eastern Europe tended to gravitate. Why don't we talk about translating into German, into French, into Arabic, into Spanish or Portuguese? We're talking about Portugal and Brazil. So you see the problem. We are Italian. Any country which has 50 million people is potentially better market than a country with 4 or 5 million people, which are half of them is practically illiterate. In other words, read zero books in their life, which seems to be Croatian situation. So basically, these are the things that need to be done. The problem are always expenses. As I said, if I want to have anything translated from Croatian into any other language, I need at least several thousand euros. And the more, how shall I put it, exotic language, despite its actual potential size of audience, the more exotic language is, this translation fee will tend to get higher. Because I'm having problem finding a proper English translator. Think about finding a proper Chinese translator or a proper Hindi translator. And mind you, it has to be a man, a person, a woman, anybody who knows both these languages and Croatian. Because I'm not talking about translating from English anymore. I'm translating directly from the language in which a work of art has been created, written, to the language in which it will be read. These translations via the English translations is, I find them troublesome. Whatever is lost in translation once, now is lost in translation at least twice.
Okay.
So basically, we on the international science fiction scene, science fiction market, call it whatever you like, we need to start talking about translations from, say, languages such as Croatian, Czech, Greek, I suppose, Serbian, which is practically the same as Croatian, Romanian, Bulgarian, Hungarian. We have to stop Russian if you wish. We have to start thinking about translating into other international languages, which will gain prominence as United States sink into oblivion. And they are on a very, very, very good way to sink. We'll see what happens in 2 months, but they're going down. 50 more years, United States, nobody will care about them. And nobody will look at their cultural influence, at their cultural models and frames and gatekeeping and anything anymore. Nobody will care about them. They are bringing it upon themselves. And so basically, this is what we have to start concentrating and thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. Natalia?
Yeah, I agree with Aleksandar about translations, and I think that's what raises the cost of translation to languages other than English as well. What usually happens, as far as I understand, and Francesco can correct me later if I'm wrong, what usually happens is you translate from whatever language to English and then from English to whatever other language, because it's much easier to find translators who know English and their own language rather than Greek and Chinese or Greek and Bulgarian, etc. And I also agree with Aleksandar about, I think that it's a wonderful idea to promote our work with non-linguistic methods. But yeah, the question is who pays for it, who labors for it, whose labor is worth something. And yeah, it comes down to publishers. If you're on your own, it's just really difficult. But if we're dreaming, I would love to see things that are multilingual, that are not just in just one language, but multiple languages. And I'm not just talking Greek and English or Croatian and English. I'm talking Greek and Croatian, Russian and French. I don't know, collaborations, new kinds of regional connections between countries. And also I'm interested in cross-disciplinary work. I write games as well, and I'm a theater person. I come from a theater background, so I'm very interested in ways that speculative fiction can be combined with live theater, live performance, escape rooms, all sorts of experimental stuff. But again, we need someone to finance it.
Okay, we have some additional questions from our person. Let's see, we have just a few minutes for discussion this. The question is that I think nationalism is very rooted in sci-fi from East Europe. Do you believe that this is necessary to step to imagine future with this?
Okay, I will be brief. I don't think it's so prominent in Czech science fiction and fantasy. It's in some fantasy cycles, but in overall, I don't think we're seeing many nationalistic stories. Most of them are quite, let's say, cosmopolitan.
The same thing from Croatia. There were maybe few during 1990s where we were in the war, etc., etc. But recently, in the past 15, 20 years, I cannot recall any story that could be called outright nationalistic. What I do like to see and what happened from 1990s in Croatia is that we have stories, generally stories, happening to Croats in Croatia, that we use Croatian characters, Croatian localities, Croatian tradition, particularly if we're talking about fantasy, because then we can introduce Croatian folklore and legends and stuff. And I believe that this is good, and that this is good that everybody who writes from all the languages, including the English speakers, should do something like that, and thus enrich the field of ideas and stories and images that are present in the field of speculative fiction in general. Okay, but I don't think we have nationalism, much less outright chauvinism in Croatian science fiction stories or novels in the last, say, 20, 30 years, and particularly not before the war, because Croatian nationalism before the Liberation War of 1991 could land you in jail, actually. So people even who felt nationalistic didn't really show it openly.
Okay, thank you.
And these people were mostly, their voices are mostly lost after the war. So I don't think we have nationalism in Croatian. I don't know about other countries.
Natalia?
Yeah, it's kind of the same for Greek science fiction. I think people are less afraid now to give their astronauts Greek names and their scientists Greek names in their stories. But I don't think you see kind of nationalism or chauvinism in these stories. On the contrary, I think that what they try to do, rather than reinforce a kind of national exceptionalism, this is Greek science fiction and we're going to take over the world or whatever. I think what happens is people are interested in complicating the national narratives and what it means to be Greek. Are we Eastern or are we Western? Are we Balkan or are we Mediterranean or are we all of these things? And I think that's fresh and necessary because it allows us to acknowledge national identity and so the regional futures we might have as something that is it has pores, it's porous, it's precarious, it's contestable, and that I think creates a possibility for a more empathetic future where people can be more fully themselves. And yeah, that's it basically. I think we're on the right track with non-nationalism.
Yep, in Russian stories and novels, we have some of the nationalisms, but it looks like sometimes it looks like for entourage of stories for these purposes. Sometimes are not. Usually that is more often situation for some of the military sci-fi, which are retrospective. We change the past and we change the future, and it is very nationalisms. At least for me, but mainly stories are, yes, they also absent chauvinism or nationalisms, and because we have a lot of books, we have a lot of opinions, and in this amount of the books, every person can find it what they want, but mainly they are not so often on the top of the list of the stories which are mentioned, which are discussed in community, etc. And one of the last questions when we have possibility to discuss. Oh, we have only questions for Natalia.
Okay.
Natalia, can you give us the names of some of your games? It's a question of the person. Yeah.
Sure. I have 2 games out with Choice of Games. The first one, which was nominated for a Nebula, it's called Rent a Vice. It's cyberpunk noir about the mediatization of individual experience. There's technology that allows you to share other people's sensual experiences. My second game is completely different. It's a retelling of the Odyssey. It's called An Odyssey, Echoes of War. It's also out by Choice of Games. And if you're interested in shorter, more interactive fiction-like games, you will find 3 of those in SubQ magazine. The first one is called Sleepless. The second one is called probably The Tunnel, but I'm not entirely sure. And the third one is All Those Parties We Didn't Cry At.
Okay, and we have just a few minutes for the short discussion, additional 1 questions. For sci-fi writers, directly writing in English, it's more important rather than in their own language, or if they want to be taken serious or not, or necessarily be in some words nationalist on his own country.
Well, for me, it's important to have stories that entertain readers both in Czech and in English. And I've never thought much about being taken seriously, but I guess I am. I hope I am. And we'll probably see that also in my newest collection, The Ship Whisperer, that was published in late August. It's a collection of my stories in English, mostly reprints. Some have been translated, most written directly in English. So we'll see what the reception is.
Yes, I'm asking maybe other way. If you have translated books in English, the community taking you seriously or not?
I guess it is, so yeah.
Yeah? Okay, thank you.
I don't think it's a matter, I don't know how seriously somebody takes me if I have a book in English or not. Of course, it's a certain ego boost, yes, but I don't know how much anybody takes seriously or not takes seriously. I don't think it changes anything, particularly as I say, in an environment, cultural environment such as Croatia. We don't have book reviews. We have very little interviews with writers, etc., etc. It's quite possible that if anybody of us in Croatia would win a Nobel Prize, it's quite possible nobody would give a damn. Quite the contrary. But writing in English, for me at least, if I start writing in English, seriously, I did not yet. Writing in English would be a mean to facilitate spreading of my ideas to other languages and avoiding, at least on my side, the expenses of translation from Croatian into English. Or if I were to do it myself, the time that I spend in such a way instead of writing something new.
Natalia?
I have never written a book in Greek, so I cannot speak to that. But I think that people probably give you more chances if you have been translated into English. So there is a kind of prestige bestowed upon you if the Anglophone world has, somehow to a certain extent embraced your work. But for me, writing in English is not about being taken seriously. It's just some stories, because what I said before, language is embodied, and I've been an immigrant in Anglophone countries for 13 years. So some of my stories need to be told in English, some of my stories need to be told in Greek, and it's simply that.
Yep. Because I'm not writer, I don't know the taking it seriously. Maybe for some person it's taking it seriously, translation in English. For some it's situation like mentioned by Aleksandar, that translated in English your story is spreading more around the world. And this is different for person, because not so many in Russia, not so many writers have possibility to live in only as writers. All persons are necessary to go to the work, to making some of the duties, and etc., etc. And in these situations, if you're not professional writer, maybe for you it's not so important taking you seriously or not taking you seriously if you have a translation in English. For you, maybe it's more interesting situation when you have spread around your idea, your stories, which you are mentioned, which you're something you're internal to the other persons. I think so. Maybe other people think in other way. And at least small questions. Of course, I think all your countries have national sci-fi conventions. But mainly, I think the second question, which are the most important one?
Well, in the Czech Republic, there is Festival Fantazie. It's the biggest one held each July in Chotěboš. And the same organizers are doing Comic Con Prague in February. The first one was this year, and hopefully it will be possible to hold the next one next year. We'll see. And apart from that, we've got many smaller conventions that are nevertheless important. because of awards such as Sparkon, which changes location every year. Then there's GameCon, mostly about games, as the name says. There is a FutureCon, different than this one. And there is Terpaslicon, which is mostly about Red Dwarf and other Britcoms and so on. So there are many, there are mostly specialized, but yeah, Festival Fantasia and Comic Con are the biggest ones.
Aleksandar?
Well, in Croatia, the biggest convention is Spheracon in Zagreb. You've been on it, so you know what I'm talking about. And it's held in May. Okay, this year we did a virtual version this year due to lockdown. We'll try to make some version in early October. Now we'll see if it will be possible. Then there is Istracon in Pazin in Istria, which hasn't been held this year. Then there is Fantasticon in Split, which is a reasonably new, relatively new convention, 5 or 6 years, but a quite good one. Also, it was held online this year. There is a convention in Slavonski Brod. There is a convention in Sisak, which was a fresh one. They managed to have 2 conventions this year, then canceled due to coronavirus. Yeah, that's about all. I don't think I missed anything important. This Recon in Rijeka, which is Eurocon this year, and will also be held online the first weekend of October. And there is Liburnikon in Opatija, which is a city close to Rijeka. That convention was held in August, late August, and they had 1 day live, and the rest was also online. So basically, these are now the most important Croatian conventions taking place. There are several more, but either I haven't visited them or haven't really heard much about them, and so on. But we have quite a lot of conventions. What?
You can invite people to Eurocon, FutureCon. It was supposed to be in Rijeka.
Yep.
And it will be
You are
held in
invited?
October online.
We are invited. All persons
Okay,
from the Eurocon in Raycon.
Yeah.
Natalia?
I'm afraid, as I said, I've been away for too long, so I've never been to a convention in Greece. I know there's a Fantasticon as well, which is, I think, relatively new. I think there used to be a Comic-Con. I'm not sure if it still exists. But yeah, if people are interested in finding conventions in Greece, they can contact me and I'll put them in contact with people who actually know what they're talking about. I'll be happy to do that.
Okay, in Russia we have at least in last year a lot of convention related to the role play game, game boarding, usual sci-fi convention, but situation was changed due to the COVID virus, and many of the conventions was breaked. And I know only 2 of the conventions which were produced in online format, and this was in St. Petersburg, in my city, for sci-fi readers assembly, and also was for some of the combination for the different. This is geek picnic related to the all geek cultures. Combinations. Of course, we have some of the Comic-Con, we have also etc. conventions, but I don't know what's now will be in this year or in next year. Situation is changed and nobody knows what will be next. Okay, I want to thank you all of you who presented on this presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And of course, I want to say that all of you can find it that our panel on the YouTube channel, and we may continue our conversation with you if you want some additional information on Discord channel, which you may find it in the group of the FutureCon on Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Live long and prosper.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.